I was born in Shippensburg, Pennsylvania, on the 6th of January, 1925. And we lived there for about 2 years. And then in 1927, my father got his first full-time job as a minister near a little town called Windsor, Pennsylvania now. So we moved. I had one older brother at the time. So there were just my brother and I, and my mother and father moved to this little town. Well, it wasn't a town. We moved to a house in the country. The church, the congregation that hired my father was made up of 3 small churches. But next to the biggest church, there was a house where we were to live. It was in the country. You couldn't see another house from where we lived. There were woods all around, and a dirt road went down the road in front of the house. Well, there was a paved road that came down to the church and to the cemetery. Okay, I should say that. There was, between the house and the church was a large cemetery. A lot of open space. So we moved there, and soon after that, of course, I had another brother, and eventually I had 2 more brothers and a sister. So there were 6 children in the family by the time before we left that place.
What did you do with your brothers? How did you entertain yourselves?
Well, being in the country, as I said, there were no other houses close, so I didn't have any little friends that I could run across the street and play with. So the only one I really had to play with were these 2 older brothers. And so we spent most of our time together when I'm talking about playtime. And I'll tell you this little story. The older brother was always in charge, and we would always, we'd start out saying, well, what are we going to do today? And I'd have a suggestion, and they'd have a suggestion. And then he would always say, well, okay, let's take a vote. So we would vote, and of course, my younger brother always voted with his brother. It was always 2-1. I always lost. And it's just what I lived with. And I complained about that a lot, but, it was still what I did for fun in the daytime. If it was winter, we played inside. We played different kinds of games. There was certainly no television. There wasn't even a radio that we listened to when we were younger. When we were outside, we played ball, and we played tag, and we played things that kids play outside, I guess. And the big open area between the house and the church was the cemetery. And we spend a lot of time running in the cemetery, playing tag, hide and seek. That was another good one in the cemetery. We'd hide. And we were very aware of what we were doing, and I know Mother didn't like that we were playing there, but she said we should be respectful and not ever disturb the flower arrangements or whatever there were. And we did. And I think we were smart enough. We knew that if anybody was around or there was anybody just visiting the cemetery, we would hide. We would disappear. We would go home. We didn't do these things when there were people around. And it was, I remember many times that we would be playing and we would see, there was one old man that was in charge of the cemetery. And we would see him coming sometimes with his shovel and his picks and what have you. And we would talk to him, and he would inform us of who had just died and that he had to now dig a grave. And we would watch him, and we would talk to him, and we knew him, and it wasn't fun, but it was what we did. And then, of course, a day or two later is the funeral, and we would be very scarce on that day. We would not be anywhere near the cemetery. But that was just an activity place we had. There was a lot of grass that, was just plain grass where there wasn't a cemetery yet. That was a good place to play ball and chase each other and what have you. So, as we were growing up, well, between the house and the cemetery, there was still a large plot of land, and we were given permission it belonged to this, probably a cemetery today, but we were given permission to cultivate it and grow things if we wanted to. In fact, it was so large that a farmer would come in the spring and plow up the ground, because you could not have, just with a shovel dug it all up. So he'd come in with a plow and turn the land over, turn the soil over, and then we would take it from there. And we planted everything. And that was our work, really, for the summer. As my brothers and I got older, we spent half of every day helping my father and mother work, pulling weeds, doing whatever needed to be done to get plants to grow. When they did grow, then, of course, there was a time to harvest and pick the peas and shell them and take the husks off the corn. And then Mother would can. And as I got older, I helped a lot with that, too. And my brothers did what they could, too. But Mother canned enough food that we got through the winter and bought very little of anything at the store. We grew what we ate. In the summertime is when that work was what we did.
Yeah.
Beside the garden plot, there was a large plot that was fenced, and there was a nice chicken house, and so we raised a lot of chickens. And that, of course, gave us our eggs and meat. We would have chicken every Sunday for lunch. That was, and that was a job for my brothers and I too, and my sister eventually too, when she got a little older. We would feed the chicken and help with the chores with that also. There's one other chore we had every day, and that was, at some point late afternoon, one of us would have to walk up across the cemetery and up along a fence row, clear to the top of a hill where the closest farm was, and we went there every afternoon to get fresh milk. My mother had no refrigerator in this house, and today I think many times I can't imagine how you raised a family of 8, how you fed a family of 8 without refrigeration. You think of the things we put in the refrigerator today. How could she possibly keep things? But she did. Just before we moved there, they put electricity in the house. I don't think we ever lived there without it. And the same with the water. A bathroom was put in on the upper level, and there was running water that we had. It was not, I don't know, maybe there was a line that came down to the church. There was water there, and perhaps it just was extended down so that we had water at the house too. But for some reason, there was no refrigerator, and we couldn't afford to buy one. And so I remember too, well, this goes on a little bit, but When we moved to the house in Maryland, which was the first move my father made later in life, there, Mother had an ice box. And because it was in a little town, there would be an iceman that would come down the street a couple times a week and deliver a block of ice. So we had an ice box there, which was better, but not perfect. And then, when I finally finished school and I had my first job, the end of the first month, I got paid once a month. It was a good-sized check. Almost all of that check I sent to my father. And the first thing they did is they went out and bought a refrigerator. Now this would have been, I don't know how many years. I should add that up. How many years she went without refrigeration in the house, but how happy she was to have that for the rest of her life. So we had a little one-room school that was just up the road from the church. Not a long walk at all. But that was the school for our territory. Other children came. Also, I would guess maybe there were 30 children in the schoolroom and one teacher. I went to that school for 8 years, had several different teachers, but I was there for the entire 8 years. At the end of those 8 years, the township that we lived in did not have a high school. So if you wanted to go on to high school, and many of the children that I went to school with did not go beyond that 8th grade. If you wanted to go to high school, the township would pay our tuition to go to high school in Winder. Oh, we haven't talked about the town, but we should get to that too, I guess. But anyhow, so of course it was important to my folks that we go on to school. So we took the test, my brothers and I, and when we passed, well, we didn't all take it at the same time. We took the test, and then we went to high school. Now, getting into high school was a walk of at least 4 miles, probably a little more than that to the high school. And there was no bus transportation. If we went to high school, we had to get ourselves there. My brothers and I were fortunate that there was a man in the church that was a teacher in town, and he would take us if we were at a certain corner at a certain time and not late. We could get in the car with him, and he would take us to school. Then we had to walk home because he did not come home at the same time we did. So it was a long walk home and mostly uphill coming home, too. But we did it. I was fortunate, I always think, in that the 8 years of elementary school and the 4 years of high school, those 12 years, we lived in this one house. When the year I was graduating from high school is when my parents made their first move, and they were going to Maryland. So then my other siblings had to change schools after that. I never had to change the school I went to. Guess my older brother didn't have to either. Yes, when we, I don't suppose I knew a lot about the town. When we started going to high school in town, then we learned to know more about the town. The town was a coal mining town, and the town was basically owned by the coal mine. The big mines that were around the town were owned, and so the whole town was what we called in those days a company town. The houses were owned by the coal mine. The stores were owned by the mining company. The miners, many of them had been brought over, the men had been brought from Italy to work the mines. And when they could, they would bring their families. When they had qualified for a house, they'd bring their families. So people that I learned to know in high school were Italian. The pupils my age could speak English, but if I was in one of their homes with a girlfriend, say, I was aware of the fact that her mother and father did not speak very good English, and but they were trying, but they never learned their English very well. There were about 350 students in my senior class. So it gives you an idea. It's a pretty good-sized town. However, there were a lot of people like me from the surrounding area that probably came to school there from townships that were around the town of Windber. The town had the high school, but a lot of us went there that were tuition-paid pupils. We were people that had grown up in Pennsylvania, and the people in the city then were more Italian and largely, of course, Catholic, which didn't have anything to do with us. I mean, they had their churches. And there was one summer day that we had all gone away. There must have been some large reunion, some large picnic, that the whole family got in the car and went, and we were gone for a whole day. When we came home late afternoon, and it was a hot day, as we got close coming down the road to the house, we saw all these white spots in the yard. And we got close enough, we realized that they were chickens, and they were dead. Somehow the gate to the chicken yard had not been secured properly, apparently, and the gate came open. We had a large dog at the time, and as the chickens escaped from the chicken yard, the dog had fun chasing them, I assume, playing with them. And of course his idea of playing was to chase them until he caught them. He would catch them by the neck and shake them, and in the process would break their necks and kill them. So these chickens were all dead. Almost all of the chickens, I wouldn't know, probably there were at least 100 chickens in that chicken yard. Now, they were not all completely. Some of them were back in the yard and did not come out. But we lost a huge. That was a big blow to lose all those chickens. We lost our egg production. We lost our meat. So that was a very sad day. And the chickens had laid in the sun, the hot sun, so long that there was nothing to do, but you could not do anything with the meat. They had to bury them, and unfortunately, it was the end of the dog also. My father took the dog somewhere, and he never came back. They were afraid that having had that experience, he would never be safe around the chickens again. My father had these 3 churches, and actually before we left that area, he had helped start a little mission church that was off in another corner of the territory that they covered. So that when we left, there were actually 4 groups of people that had a meeting place. And when it was a big job for my father, because it covered a large territory. And he was expected to, be at all 3 places at different times, and had contacts with people in this large area. So it meant that he had to have a car to travel, and it was hilly region, and getting around was not easy, particularly in the winter when there was often a lot of snow. But it was a busy job for him. He had one office in the house. He took one room of the house for his office. And the thing that the churches had in those days, we had what they called lay ministers. They were people who were good people who liked to preach too. And so they would be ordained, and my father would have schedule with them to cover that places, because he could only be one place at a time. And so each Sunday he would be at a different church, and they would have a rotation of these ministers that would fill the pulpits where my father couldn't be on a given Sunday. So it was a big job. Both my mother and father were brought up in the Church of the Brethren. Not at the same place, but so grew up with families who were very church-oriented. My grandfather was a church minister also, but he was a lay minister. He was a farmer, but he was a lay minister. That was my mother's father. Why my father chose the ministry, I'm not sure, but he went to college with the idea that that's what he would do. And after 4 years at the college, then he went to the seminary for 3 years. So it was his choice. We were at Windber from 1927 to 1942, over the 30s. And people were poor. Of course, most of the people at the church we went to were farmers. And living was hard. And so my father was promised a certain salary that these three churches went together and collected each month. But they never quite made budget. And so I don't know if I should be saying that. So anyhow, they were always behind. And I think that's why we had to rely so much on the garden and the things. We often were not paid. Growing up, all my clothes was given to me. I had clothes that somebody else had worn the year before. People were good to my mother and they gave her things. Either that or my mother made them. And I had clothes that were made out of feed sacks and all sorts of things. But anyhow, I never had clothes that I could really be proud of until the beginning of my senior year in high school. I tried on my winter coat, and the sleeves came halfway up to the elbow. And Mother said, "Faye, you have to have another coat." And yes, Faye wanted another coat too. And Mother said, if we don't get one, she said, we're going to have to go to the company store and buy one. So none were forthcoming, and so one day Mother takes me to the company store, and we found a rack of clothes that were my size and in her price range probably. And I actually tried on a new coat. Oh, the feeling of a new coat that never had been worn by anybody. Perhaps tried on, but never worn. I was so proud of that coat. So through my senior year in high school, and the next year when I went to college, I had a coat that was mine. And I can't tell you how happy that made me. After high school, well, after high school, it was decided, well, my mother and father said all along that we're all going to go to college. Some way we're going to go to college. And, of course, the idea of how we were going to afford it was always the question. So when my older brother graduated from high school, he actually got a scholarship from the state of Pennsylvania. He passed a test that he passed and was given a sizable, not sizable, but a scholarship that would pay, I think, probably half his tuition. My mother and father went to Elizabethtown College, which is a Church of the Brethren college in eastern Pennsylvania, which is really, it was out of the territory for my brother and I to go there, but it was the college that my mother and father were familiar with. So somehow it was decided that we would go there. And my brother went there, and so when it was time for me to go, well, Faye was going to go. That meant one car could go to the same place rather than going two different places. So again, no, I'm not doing this well at all. I should do this over. In the town where Elizabethtown College is, my father had an aunt. She was my father's full aunt. And she had helped raising my father because his mother had died at an early age. Well, when she knew that my older brother was coming to college, she said that he could live with her. She would give him room and board, and then he would walk out to the college as a day student. And then, but she required that he help her do work. She and her husband were the janitors at the church. They lived close to the church. And so my brother helped her every Saturday. He helped her dust the pews and do the things he needed to do, that she needed to have done for cleaning up the place. And that's how he really was able to go to school. That helped a lot for him to go to school. Then when it was time for me to go on to college, Galen had gotten a job at the college that was going to pay that tuition for him. It was with his chemistry department, something that he could do. So then he said he was going to live at the college. And then the aunt said, well, okay, Faye will live at the college. Faye will live with me. And she can help me with this cleaning. And then I will remember this forever. My older brother said to my parents, no, we've got to find a way for Faye to live at the college. You're just not part of the college life if you're living downtown. And I will thank him forever for standing up and seeing to it that we found a way that when I went to Elizabethtown, I was in the dormitory, full dormitory life. Well, when I started thinking about college, at that time, if you went to college, a girl, you were either going to be a school teacher or you were probably going to become a trained nurse. That's what girls did in those days. I did not want to be a school teacher, and I didn't want to be a nurse either, so I kind of had a problem and couldn't decide. But it was sort of destined that I was going to have to go and do something. So then Galen, my older brother, again rescued me and said, well, there's a good field for women in medical technology. she would need to go to college for a couple years and then go into a medical school training program for technology. So that sounded good to me. I liked the idea that instead of dealing with patients, you would be dealing with numbers and formulas. And it sounded good to me. So I decided that was it, and that's what I enrolled in. So I was 2 years at Elizabethtown, getting mostly chemistry and biology courses. And then when those 2 years were up, there were a couple other girls in the class that were in the same program. And we were told that there was a good program in Philadelphia at the Jefferson Medical School. And so we went and applied, and a number of us went there in the end. We worked at the hospital every day, and part of it, of course, was schooling. But we couldn't live at the hospital. They didn't have rooms for us, so we had to find our own place to live. It was during the war, and we found that we could get a good room at the YMCA. And the YMCA was just within a few blocks of the hospital, so it was very convenient. The night that I took the train from Maryland to Philadelphia to start this school program, I got into Philadelphia about 10 o'clock at night. And I had no idea how far the train station was from the YMCA. And I stood there trying to think, can I afford a taxi cab? There were taxi cabs all over the place. Thought, can I afford a taxi cab? And finally I decided, yes, you're going to spend the money on a cab. I didn't want to try to find a bus at 10 o'clock at night when I didn't know where I was in town. Wasn't sure how far I was from where I even needed to go. So get in the cab. And then I discovered, as I said, it was during the war, how things were. The cab driver filled the cab up. There were 3 of us on the back seat and 2 people in the front seat with him. There were 5 passengers in the cab. So he took his clipboard and he said, now where are you going and where are you going? He wrote them all down, and then he figured which would be the closest. And from place to place, he figured it out. And what I discovered afterwards was that I only had to pay from where the other person got out to where I was going, which was almost nothing, as it turned out. After worrying for a half an hour whether or not I could afford it, I was at the YMCA. I was the last person to get out of the cab. So as next to the last person got out, the cab driver looked at me and he said, you want to go to the YMCA? I said, yes. He said, are you sure? And then he said, don't you mean you want to go to the YWCA? And I said, no, I'm going to the YMCA. So he said, you know what that is? I said, yes, I think I know. I have a reservation there, which he still didn't believe. But he took me to the YMCA. And he gets out of the cab and gets my big suitcase out of the trunk. And then he carries it into the YMCA for me. And I went to the desk and asked about my reservation, and the guy handed me my key, had me sign a paper, and I was going to go to the elevator to go to my room, and I turned around, and I saw the cab driver walking out of the lobby, shaking his head. He could not believe that I was going to live at the YMCA. But that was during the war. and even the YMCA had to make some changes for their program. So I was in Philadelphia for 2 years, from 1944 and 1945, during those last war years. Well, the reason we had these nice rooms, were because the men were all somewhere else, and the Y rented them to us because they wanted to rent them. Anyhow, we were there. I'm thinking about this. It was the 12th of May, when the war ended in Europe, when the war in Germany ended. And that night, the town just broke loose. People were all over the streets. We were, as I said, my room was on the 25th floor at the Y, and we could look down and see people just exuberated, you know. They were so happy. All the sailors had come up from the naval station, and they were just people all over the place. Well, at one point, we decided, well, let's go down and join the fun, a couple of the girls and I. So we went down the elevator and went out in the street. And we soon realized that this was not the safest place to be. People were just grabbing everybody and hugging everybody and just having a ball. And so after one hug, I decided this is not where I'm going to stay. I went back to the Y. We went back up the elevator, and we watched from the 25th floor after that the rest of the evening, because I felt it was not safe, really. Although I don't know that anything would happen, but it was a happy time for everybody. So then I was there then yet through that summer. And the war in Japan ended the middle of August. And I was there until the 1st of September. And the 1st of September, my year was up. And then I found a job and left Philadelphia. It was easy to find a job in those days. Applied at several hospitals. But the first one I applied to was about 10 miles from Shippensburg, which is the town where I was born, in Pennsylvania. Now, this would have been maybe 60 miles from where my parents were living in Maryland. And I was living they had a room in the nurse's home, and had 3 meals a day, and had my living taken care of. So it was a very small hospital, and there was one other woman that she ran the lab, and I was working with her, and there was just enough work for 2 people, and we did everything from scratch. I mean, it was not the way things are done today, but I enjoyed the job. I really think I liked it. We, because it was such a small hospital, we took turns being on call at night. If there was an emergency and someone needed a blood test of some sort, we could be called at 2 a.m. and we had to go back over to the lab and do whatever was necessary. And that was fun. There was one time that the other woman who was working with me, her mother died, and she left for about 3 weeks, and I was there, and then I had to be on call night and day for that whole period of time. And it got a little strenuous at that point. And it may not have been at that time, but there was one time that I had a call. I was on call, and there was a movie in town I wanted to go see. And one of the nurses said, "Come on, let's go to the movie." And I said, "Well, I'm on call." And she said, "Well, we'll go and we'll tell them at the movie theater that you're on call. And if they need you, they will call. They will let you know. And there's always a cab on the square outside the movie theater, and you could get a cab and run back to the hospital real quick." So I did that. And so sure enough, halfway through the movie, they interrupted the sound track and said that Miss Graham was wanted at the hospital immediately. So Miss Graham jumped up from her seat and got back to the hospital. The only night I think that I ever tried to do that, and so help me, I got caught. But I got there and did what I had to do. There's one other story at the hospital. As I said, the hospital was 10 miles from where I was born. And there was a doctor in the town where I was born who had actually delivered me. In Shippensburg, there was no hospital. And so that doctor, if he had a patient in the hospital, that patient would be in the hospital where I was. And so I would see his name on orders. And I had told my mother about it one time. And the mother said, "Well, if you ever have a chance, talk to him and tell him who you are. Maybe he would remember us, you know." And so I always sort of thought, well, someday I'm going to have a chance to talk to this doctor. One night I was leaving the nurse's office, posted my last results, and I was leaving, and the nurse said to me, "Who's on call tonight?" And I said, "Well, I'm on call tonight." And she said, well, she hoped there wasn't going to be any calls, and I should go home and go to my room and rest. So before I got out the door, the phone rang, and the nurse waved for me to stop, and she said, she talked to the doctor, got the orders that she was getting. Then she hung up, and she said, "You're not going to get off easy tonight because there's a patient being sent in." And it was a patient we knew because she was an old woman, and she was a serious diabetic. And she didn't take her insulin, and she didn't eat right, and she was always being in a diabetic coma, and then someone would find her, and they would bring her to the hospital. So in a case like that, I would probably be called upon to check her blood sugar immediately. But in this case, the doctor did not ask for any lab work to be done. And the nurse said, "No, you don't need to do anything." He didn't order anything. Turned out the doctor was the doctor who had delivered me. I knew he was an old man. I knew he wasn't the greatest of doctors. But this bothered me. I said to the nurse, I said, "Well, how does he know that she's in a diabetic coma?" That's what she usually would be in. But I said, "It's possible that she's in a diabetic, in an insulin shock. She's in insulin shock, rather." And the nurse said, "Well, yeah, I don't know how he knows." I said, "Well, I don't feel good about this." And I told her, I said, "I'm going to go down to the lab, and I'm going to get my equipment. So when that patient comes into the emergency room, I'm going to take a sample of blood. And then I said, I will see what it looks like real quick for you." And the thing is, the nurse was given orders to set up an IV and immediately give this woman insulin, a large dose of insulin. I said, if she's in insulin shock, that's not what she needs. Anyhow, the nurse said, well, okay. So I did what I said I would do. And when I got halfway through the test, and this is interesting, to do a sugar test in those days, it took about half an hour. Today, I poke my finger and I know within an instant what my sugar is. In those days, it was an entirely different ballgame. Anyhow, halfway through the test, I could tell that this woman had absolutely no sugar in her blood, that she was in insulin shock. So I called the nurse and I said, don't give her that insulin. And then about that time, the doctor came in. And the nurse said to me, she said, well, you're going to have to tell the doctor. She said, I'm not going to tell him what we did. And of course, the thing was, I was not supposed to do that. I was taught that I never did anything without an order from the doctor. I could have been in trouble. And yet, it didn't make sense to me. Anyhow, when the doctor came in, the nurse said, you need to go down to the lab and talk to the girl down there. He couldn't understand why he needed to do that. And he came blustering into the lab, and I realized this is my first chance to meet Dr. Sutliff, his name was. He comes in and says, what's going on here? And I told him what I had done. I didn't tell him who I was. I thought, I'm not going to tell you who I am at this point, but I'm going to. I told him what I had to tell him. He gave a very gruff remark, didn't thank me, turned on his heels, went out the door. I don't know what I did, or whether I should have done what I did. But he went back up to the lab and immediately ordered the woman be given some glucose, and she immediately came out of her shock, and she lived for another year or two anyhow. And I always felt badly because I didn't have the nerve at that point to stop him and tell him what I wanted to tell him. So, the end of the story. When I went to Elizabethtown College, it's a very small college to start with, so it didn't take long to know everybody that was there. And we had a get-together night, though, early on to meet the other freshmen, and I met Don that night. Just one of the many other guys that I met. But right away, I started seeing a different person. There was another man who was a sophomore at the time, and we started hanging out together. So for that whole freshman year, I spent my time with this other person. The other person was a very good friend of Don's. And Don was a very good friend of this boyfriend of mine. And so there were even times that we would go to the movie, and my friend would say to me, you know, Don was in the dormitory all by himself. Would it be okay if he went along to the movie with us? And I'd always say, well, I don't care if he walks downtown to the movie with us. And so it would be sort of a threesome. Don was interested in me, but because I was seeing his best friend, he decided not to make waves. And he just was happy to be close. Anyhow, so spring came, and at some point, the first relationship broke up. And my friend, you know, he told me he really didn't want to It wasn't that he didn't want to see me anymore, but he said he had 2 more years of college, and he said, I have 3 years of the seminary. He was going to become a minister. He was going to go to the seminary for 3 years. He said, I have 5 more years of schooling. He said, I'm afraid we're getting too serious. So let's just stop seeing each other for a while. Well, I was brokenhearted because I really was kind of thinking that was good. It was a good relationship. So my friend goes back down to the dorm and tells his friend, Don, that he was breaking up with me. Well, of course, Don didn't say anything, but he was happy as a lark without telling anybody. And so that weekend, before the weekend was over, Don caught up with me somewhere and said, why don't we go somewhere, take a walk, whatever. I don't know what it was we did. I wasn't ready for another relationship. I was still broken up from the first one. But after being pushed a couple of times, I don't think I went with him the first time, but I soon started seeing him. And believe me, he knew this was what he wanted long before I was ready to say yes. So even almost from the start, he knew that he was going to propose. And it didn't take him long either. So anyhow, but it was right at the end of the school year. So within 2 weeks, I guess, we went our separate ways, and I went home to Maryland, and he went to his home, and at least once, maybe twice, that summer he hitchhiked down to Maryland to spend a weekend with me. So, and then we came back the second year. We were both sophomores. And, of course, that year we were just together all the time. And by Christmas he had proposed. And he still had 2 more years of school, and so did I. And so we just decided to be engaged. And when we could get married, we would get married. When we were through with school, we didn't want to do it while we were still trying to do our schooling. When my parents left Windber, they moved to Myersville. So when I started college, we lived in Windber till I graduated from high school. And then that summer I went to Maryland. We went to Maryland. And so when I went to college, I was living in Maryland and would go home there. When I'd go home for vacations and stuff, that was where I would go. Never went back to Windber. In those days, the ministers at the seminary were told that when they left one church to go to another one, they were to drop their contacts with people in that church. You know, you just don't go back and, well, you could get mixed up with the politics of the church if you went back, and it was better not to. That's what they were told. We never went back to Windber until quite a few years later. There was one time they were having this is just history. There was one time they were having an anniversary, and they wanted my father to come back for the service, for a service, to speak, as I recall. And I went back that weekend. That was the first time I'd ever gone back after we had graduated. Well, it was not in the territory that I would be in, you know. So I didn't. It was out of the way. It was not where we were going in those days. My father was he was just an ordinary minister, but he stuck to the rules of the church and kept his children, tried to make his children behave the way he thought they should too. So we did, and it was very traditional church, particularly the one in the country. And even the other churches he was at, all the churches I would say that my father was at were very traditional. There was one church in Maryland, and then there were two down in Virginia that he had. And then finally his last parish was back up in Pennsylvania. And so that definitely was good old Pennsylvania brethren. The 19th of May. We were married in the college chapel. My father came and married us, and it was good in some ways because we really wanted some of our friends to be there. And had it been after graduation, they would have all been scattered, and it would have been, we wouldn't have had as many friends at the wedding as we did. But it was a dumb wedding because we just had this little ceremony, and then we went our merry way. And in fact, all the seniors had to go to baccalaureate service that night. There was a service at the church that night that they were all expected to be there. So we get through with the wedding, we grab ourselves a bite to eat, where there was no reception, which it gives me goosebumps when I think about it now, how I did such a dumb thing. But we had to go to church that night, and then we went to a hotel. We had reservations in a hotel that night, and then had to be back at the college at 10 o'clock in the morning for the graduation. Then we had 2 weeks. There was a 2-week period in there, which was why we did it when we did it. There was a 2-week period in there that I had vacation time and he had a chance, or he had time before he was going on to his next project, so that we could get a little vacation, get a little honeymoon in there. We went to Niagara Falls. Where else do people go? I don't know. In those days, people thought it was the place to go. No, and that's where we went. We drove up to Niagara Falls, drove through parts of Pennsylvania and a good bit of New York, places we'd never been. I went back to work at the hospital. I just had a vacation, and Don went to Illinois. He wanted to get into a cooperative institute where he spent the summer really learning what he could say and do and should do and so on in the cooperative field. And that's what he wanted to do that summer, and wanted to get in before he would find a job. Well, yes, when he came back from the Co-op Institute in the summer, the end of the summer, 1946 this was, he got a job in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. So I resigned from the job I had and went to Harrisburg. There were 2 big hospitals in Harrisburg, and one of them needed me. So I went to work right away. I wasn't out of work at all. And we found a place to live. Very small apartment. And we were only there 6 months. And then he was called to Illinois to try to start a small co-op. And I was pregnant. I did not want to go. I wanted to stay in Pennsylvania for the rest of my life. But I found that early that wasn't going to happen, I guess. Anyhow, I, after a lot of thought and what have you, decided I have got to go where he goes, and I accepted it. He went to Illinois,
What town?
Elgin, Illinois, where the church headquarters is. It was a group of the people at the church headquarters that wanted to start a little co-op and had gotten his name somehow. He went, I would say, the end of January, and I was pregnant and wanted to keep working. I wasn't due until 1st of October. I wanted to work as long as I could. And I didn't want to, I figured if I'd stayed there in Harrisburg for a few more months, why then maybe I'd be ready to quit working anyhow. And so we moved out of the small apartment we were in. He went to Illinois, and I found a room in a house and that was close to the hospital. Well, I was there about 2 weeks, and one day I came home from work, and the landlady said, "You're wanted on the phone. Somebody in Elgin, Illinois wants you." And it was someone at the hospital in Elgin wanted to talk to me about a job. Don had told me afterwards that he just couldn't stand being alone in Elgin, and so he went to the hospital and talked to whoever was in charge and said, would there be any possibility there would be a job here? His wife was a technician, but she was pregnant and she wasn't going to work too long. But if you wanted someone for 4 or 5 months, why, this was the person you might want. Well, they wanted me. And so I went to work the next day in Harrisburg, gave them 2 weeks' notice, and packed my bags and went to Illinois. Don liked to go on the train. He took the train out first to even talk about the job, and then when he moved himself out, he packed up the trunks and so on and put them on the train, and that was an easy way actually to travel if you wanted to take some time. But I didn't want to go on the train. I said, I am not going to go on the train. It was about a 18-hour trip, and I was not feeling very good. I had a lot of morning sickness, and I didn't want to be on a train and be feeling that way. So someone said, well, why don't you take a plane? Nobody in my family had ever been on a plane. Hadn't even heard much about plane travel in those days. But in Harrisburg, there was an airport, and I went and got a ticket, and I flew to Illinois. So I was the first in the family to fly. We got to Illinois. We had a very hard time finding a place to live. And it was shortly after the war, and I don't know, a lot of people were moving around, and it was hard to find a place to live. But finally, we did find a small apartment in a house. It was a big house that was made into 4 apartments, in fact. And we lived there for a time. But they had rented a building for this co-op, which was just a little old store. And above the store, there was a full-size apartment. There were 3 bedrooms up there. It was a big place, I guess as big as the store. And when he started the job, when they rented the building, the co-op wanted him to be able to live there, but they had to first break a contract with the people who were living there, ask them to leave, which was not too kind, but that's what we did. And then, well, they really wanted him to live up there because he had better control of the store and so on if we were there. Anyhow, as soon as we could, we moved into that apartment, and then we were in the nicest place we had ever lived. And after we were there, well, I had Jim before we moved in there even. I worked up right until the time Jim was born. And then I didn't work anymore. I decided I was going to, well, Dawn decided that I was going to be a full-time mother. And Dawn was good at deciding how things were going to be. It was hard because his salary was very little. My salary was about twice what his was when I quit that job. So we didn't live too well. We didn't have a car for several years. Couldn't afford one. Anyhow, we were happy in that apartment, and it wasn't long until Jerry came along. I had two. But things were doing better. I mean, the store had gotten started, and the salary was better, of course, once they got things going. And I was pregnant the third time. And yes, I was pregnant before we moved. So then Don at one point got this call from, knew about this big co-op in Washington, D.C., suburban Maryland. And Don got this chance to, well, he went to Maryland, was interviewed, and they wanted him to come. And so we decided that was what we were going to do. It was really a good offer for him, and we just needed to do this. And I was pregnant with John. So we moved sometime in May, and this would be 1952. We moved in May of 1952. John was born in July. So we moved, so we were moving to Greenbelt, Maryland, which was an interesting town. It was a planned community. There were nice row houses that you could rent. And so we were in a house for the first time, although it was a very small house. It only had 2 bedrooms. But we felt very happy in this house. And Don was very happy with his job for a while. Well, he was very happy with his job the whole time he was at Greenbelt. And I was, I was very happy to be back in Maryland, which is only 120 miles from where my folks were in Pennsylvania. You know, it got us much closer to home. And I was just very happy to be there. I was happy in Elgin, too. I didn't have trouble. I liked being there, but it was too far from home. In Elgin, I was so tied down with 2 babies, and then particularly, well, to tell the truth, I was going to say we didn't have a car. I didn't know how to drive. When we did get a car, I wasn't driving anywhere. So I wasn't, but with 2 little babies, I was out with the walker, taking them for walks, and you're busy with 2 little ones. You don't have time to be doing much socializing anyhow. Then we moved to Maryland, and there you were very close to people. The little houses were very close together, and I found myself meeting a lot of people that were very different than me. People that weren't educated, They had jobs and so on, but they weren't college people. They weren't religious people. Um, this house we were living in talking about me now, the house we were living in Maryland, you had a front stoop and a back stoop. It was a row house. And in the morning, I'd get up, and I had, well, by the time we were in Maryland, I had 3 babies right after we got there. So I was pretty busy just doing what I had to do. But in the morning, you would clean up the kitchen, and you'd go out and sit on the stoop with your second cup of tea or whatever you had a little chance to for a little break. And somebody from next door would come and sit and talk, and it was quite an education to me to meet people who were quite different than I was, and brought up differently than I had been brought up. I remember one morning, I'm sitting on the stoop with this friend, and there were a couple of others standing there, and we were just talking, and the woman that was sitting with me had a little boy who was the same age as Jim. He comes around the corner of the house, crying, tears are flowing, and he comes to his mother, and she said, "What's wrong?" And he said, "Well, so-and-so hit me." And his mother said, "Well, what did he hit you with?" He said, "Well, he hit me with a stick." And so the mother reached down by the porch, and she found a little stick. It wasn't really much of a stick. She found a little stick. She gives it to him. She said, "Here, go hit him back." Well, that was just totally foreign to me. I didn't say a word, but I thought, well, kind of people they are. So then, I don't know if it was the same morning or another morning. The same thing happens, and it's Jim that comes around the corner, crying. I said to him, "Come here, let's see what's wrong." The other mother didn't even console her son. She just wanted to know what happened. And but I was trying to console Jim and figure out where he was hurt, and was he indeed hurt. And he said that he was playing in the sandbox, and he accidentally bumped the sandcastle somebody was making, and so the kid hit him. And what else? And so I had other things to say. I said, "Well, that's too bad." I said, "You really, should be careful," and so on and so on. And I said to him, I said, "Maybe you could go back and help him build it back up." Once the tears stopped, I said, "Why don't you go and see if you can't maybe tell him you're sorry and see if you can't help fix it." So he walks away happily. And I remember the couple of the women that were there, and they just sort of looked at me quizzically. And finally, one of them said, "Where do you go to church?" Which, I don't know. I never thought about it. Just the way I was brought up and the way I was. And so it was interesting. I really kind of enjoyed being with these women who were this way. It was eye-opening. Yes, to me it was. I had always lived in a church community, I think, my parents' friends, and so I'd never been exposed to this sort of thing. Then there's another story about a month or two later, the lady that lived in the end of the unit that we were living in had gone to the hospital to have a baby. And her husband had taken off from work because she had 2 other children. And they were, the husband had stayed home with the kids because that's what we had to do. And then one morning we were sitting on the stoop talking, and one of the girls said that Mary was coming home from the hospital this afternoon. And I thought about it for a while, and then I said, you know, I'm doing a meatloaf for dinner tonight. I'm going to make 2 meatloaves, and I'm going to take one over there for them for dinner when they get home. Well, this started something. And the girls said, one of them said, well, why don't I make some scalloped potatoes? And this thing snowballed. And yeah, well, why don't we do that? And so they were good people, but they were different, you know. And before the day was over, I took my vacuum cleaner over and I ran vacuum around the living room, you know. And we washed the dishes that were left over in the sink that the husband hadn't gotten done from the night before. The house was kind of spotless, but not spotless, but it looked a lot better when this lady came home from the hospital and found she had dinner and realized her neighbors had done this. You know. It was a good thing, but that started it. And after that, it always happened. When somebody was ill, somebody would find a way of doing something. I always felt good about that. Don was asked to take a job in Puerto Rico. They wanted him to go down there and work with the Puerto Rican government improving grocery stores on the island. And so we moved. He was given a contract for a year, so I have 4 children by this time. Jeff was born in October the 20th of 1955. And this was, actually it was in November of 55 that Don went down there. And then he came back and they had given him this contract for a year. And so when it was for a year, he decided that we were all going to go. And so we went the 1st of January, 1956. But we were down there. I'm not talking about that. I'm really talking about, this is about the girls in Greenbelt. But anyhow, we were down there for a year. We were down there for a year and a half. And then at one point, they wanted him to come back to Greenbelt. And so just on a very quick move, we came back. And we had rented the house that we owned. We owned that house by that time. We were no longer renting it. We had rented it to a couple, but we also had an agreement that on a month's notice we could come back and they would move. And so we had given them a month's notice and we were coming back. So we flew back, the 6 of us, back to Maryland. And Don's brother, Ern, and his wife were living close to us. He was teaching at the University of Maryland. And they met us at the airport and took us to their house, and she had dinner for us. While we're sitting at dinner, my sister-in-law said, well, you're just going to stay here with us tonight. She said, I don't want, we're not going to go back to the house tonight because you're going to have to clean. You don't know how these people left the place. You're going to have to make your beds. And so she said, we'll just put the kids down on the floor and we'll just stay here. You'll stay here with us tonight. And I was tired enough from a day flight with 4 children. I was tired enough to agree to anything. And so we did. And we were getting ready to go to bed and the phone rang. And one of the girls, my sister-in-law, answers the phone. And it was one of these neighbors that I had in Greenbelt, calls and says, well, first of all, she called to see, do you have a brother-in-law and sister-in-law by the name of Don and Faye? Because this woman didn't know where she was calling. She was just calling at Lefever in the phone book. And Margaret said, well, yes, I do. And then this woman said, then she explained, she said, I'm a neighbor of theirs in Greenbelt. We wondered when they were going to get here. Are they coming today? And my sister-in-law said, yes, they're here. They're going to stay here with us for the night. And this friend seemed very disappointed. She said, "Oh, well, we were expecting them to get here for the day, for the night. We were hoping they would get here. We've been watching for them to come." And then Margaret explained that it just didn't seem like I should do any more work that day. And the friend said, "But their beds are all made, and the house is clean." And then they tell us, of course, that these girls had done the same thing for me. They had actually broken into the house, found a window that wasn't locked, and crawled in, and spent the whole day, these girls spent the day cleaning and fixing the house. And they went to the store. There was milk, cereal, eggs in the refrigerator. No, the cereal wasn't in the refrigerator, but milk and eggs in the refrigerator. There was a big pot of soup on the stove. And there was, in the middle of the dining room table, there was a cake that said, it was decorated, and it said on the top, "Welcome home, Lefevers." I get tears. I've got tears in my eyes. That was just so precious to me. We had been gone for a year and a half, but they were anxious. These girls were anxious to have us come back, have me come back. I don't know about Dawn and the kids, but it shows, I guess, what you can do too. I felt so good about that. Well, when we came back to Maryland, things were quite different, and Dawn has got a much larger salary at this point. I don't know if I should say that, but things are going much better for Dawn at this point. And it was better enough that we decided to buy a big house. This is when we bought the big house in Beltsville. Beltsville is about 5 miles from Greenbelt. And so we bought the house and we moved from Greenbelt. The house had a full basement. Dawn wanted to have tools for the boys. And this was very important to us, that we have a bigger house, I guess, with the 4 boys. Dawn was very happy with his work. And at that point, this was the end of LBJ's presidency. He started right after Martin Luther King was killed. LBJ started what he called his war on poverty. He created a small department in the government that would supposedly help people, poor people, get better living conditions, better food supplies, better living. And now tell me who the man was that was the head of that department. Sergeant Shriver, the guy who was a brother-in-law to the guy who started the Peace Corps. Sergeant Shriver was the one that LBJ appointed head of the war on poverty. Okay? And so Dawn was asked to take a job in Washington with the War on Poverty Department. His goal, or his object that he was supposed to do, was to help people get the idea of how they can start buying clubs, small co-ops where they can get food better. And so Don stopped his job with Greenbelt. Well, they gave him leave. They gave him leave from his job to go into this job in Washington. And the one thing that they asked him to do was to write a pamphlet, a book, about starting co-ops and starting buying clubs, just helping people know how to get started, to find maybe some cheaper food. And he also tried to start a couple small co-ops in the inner city, which never worked, of course, too well. But people in the inner cities they don't have cars, they can't get to the big stores in the suburbs, and they had trouble. They paid twice as much for the food they did get. Anyhow, he was to write a pamphlet that was to be a government pamphlet, and when he had it finished and it was approved, it was printed by the government printing office. They printed 50,000 copies, and any government pamphlet like that is free to anybody in the United States. And they were to get these pamphlets were all prepared. And then Richard Nixon was elected. And LBJ was out. And of course and this was just months. The pamphlet was finished just months before Nixon took over. When Nixon took over, he took over the war on poverty, but he took it over and did away with it. You know, you just get rid of it. And one of the first orders with the guy that he appointed was to shred those pamphlets. 50,000 pamphlets, and they just shredded them. And nobody ever got any benefit out of them. Anyhow, his job was over with the government, and he went back to Greenbelt, and then that was right about the time then that he was being pushed for this national job, and which took us to Ohio. The town was called Alliance, Ohio. Universal Cooperatives, is the name of the big organization. Universal Cooperatives had different places where they worked. And Don was to take over the National Grocery Department. And he was told that that office was in Albert Lea, Minnesota. So Don comes home and he said, they want me to move to Albert Lea, Minnesota. And my first response is, I will not live in Minnesota, let alone Albert Lea. I was not going to go to some little town in Minnesota. I just absolutely drug my feet. It was the first time I ever really put up much of a fuss about it. And so then the man who was trying to hire Don said, well, they also had a headquarters in Alliance, Ohio. He said, if you take the job, we'll move the office to Alliance, Ohio. So then Don comes home from another meeting. He said, would I live in Alliance, Ohio? Would I go there? And I said, well, I knew it was 30 miles from the line to Pennsylvania. I thought, you know, it's not much further than I was in Maryland from family. So I agreed that I would move to Alliance, Ohio. That year was 1974. And the week that we moved was the week that Nixon resigned. Never forget that. We bought a house in Alliance, and we left the 4 boys in the house in Maryland. Jim and Jerry were both going to the University of Maryland, which was 3 miles down the road. And I think John had a job, and Jeff was a senior in high school. And the 4 of them just said, well, the older ones, of course, were not going to move with us. I wanted Jeff to move with us because I felt responsible for him yet somehow. And he said, nope, he was not going. He was not going. And he didn't, and we left him stay. Anyhow, we rented the house to them. Jim and Jerry, with going to college, were living there, free. Well, I guess not quite free, but anyhow. And they were both working part-time. They could afford to pay us a little bit for the house, and they really didn't need to. But yes, we rented the house to them, and we moved out. And it's laughable to me how we moved. There were 4 bedrooms upstairs, and each of the boys took a bedroom. We moved out of our bedroom, and then Jeff, I think, took over my bedroom. And so when the movers came, we said, don't touch anything in the 4 bedrooms. And I went through things in the kitchen. I took the good kettles. I took the good dishes. I left the bent kettles there, the ones that had dents in them. We left things there that we didn't want, that I didn't want, and that's what these kids had to deal with. And I'll never forget, we had a large rectangular table. We had a formal dining room. And this large table, we took the 6 chairs, but we left the table. So how they were supposed to manage without chairs, I don't know, but we left them and they had to deal with it. And they did very well. But we had a dining room like this, which was just a little nook, you know. And so we had to buy a small round table to put in there. Now that table gets big and comes all the way out here. But for practical purposes, it needed to be a small table. And we had a nook like that in Ohio. So we couldn't take the big table, but we took the chairs. So we didn't want to buy chairs at that time. So we bought a house in Ohio. And it was a brand new house. I'd never lived in a brand new house. It smelled new. Nobody had ever lived in it. And it was just a little bungalow on 1 floor. Oh, I loved it. And had a nice yard. And a garage, a double garage. But we were happy there. It was tough on Philip to suddenly be without his 4 brothers, because he really relied on them. They were all very good to him. When Philip was maybe 3 years old, he would get an encyclopedia and he would take it to one of them, one of his 4 brothers, and say, "What is this?" And they would read it to him. And that kid, as Jerry was saying, he memorized things. He knew more things. These 4 older brothers just taught him everything. And he learned it. He remembered it. So Philip was different than the rest of them. But it was a real tough break for Philip to have to move and be without his brothers. And I realize that now. But it's what we had to do. The man who changed the job from Albert Lea to Alliance, Ohio, you know, he did this. I mean, he did this to get Don to work for them. And he knew what he was doing to me, but he didn't tell us what he was doing. But at the time that he did that, made that move, he actually was working on a move to move the whole. They were going to coordinate these offices that were around the country. And they were going to coordinate them all in one spot. And it was either going to be in Minneapolis, Chicago, or St. Louis. He knew that. He knew that he was moving me to Alliance, Ohio, instead of Albert Lea. but that it was a matter of a year, 2 years, that I was going to move somewhere else that I didn't want to go. He knew that. So we moved to Alliance, and we were there about 2.5 years. And one day Don went to work, and he said, there's something big coming down today. And he didn't know what it was, but there was a big meeting, and he knew it was going to be something. He came home at lunchtime, and he said, we're going to have to move to Minneapolis. Well, it just about killed me, I thought. So he was home for lunch, and he went back to work. And, of course, I'm talking to some of the other women that I met in Alliance who were going to have to come to Minneapolis, too. There was 1 or 2 women that I knew pretty well. And that afternoon, of course, we were all crying on each other's shoulders. But you do what you have to do. And as I said, I don't think I knew it right away. But later on, I was told that that this man who did this, that he knew all along what he was doing. But he wanted Don for that job. And I guess that's the way it is. So I moved to Minneapolis. We moved in here the first week in November. And Don was still, they were moving the offices here, but he still had to work some in Ohio. So we came here 1 week, and the mover brought all our stuff, and we got settled in the house. And on Sunday, Don had to fly back to Ohio. So Philip and I were going to be here alone, which is okay. But my sister had called, and she said, Faye, she said, on Sunday, I'm bringing Mother out to see you. And I said, okay. And it just worked out that Don was leaving. Yeah, I'd be glad to have some company. And so my sister gets my mother on the plane. And actually a friend of my sister's came, that I know also, came with them. There were the 3 of them that came. So, and that was the best thing that happened, so far as my mother was concerned. She came here. She saw the house was decent. She saw the city was nice. She decided that this is not a bad place. It made her feel good that she could see in her mind where I was. She would have been very unhappy if it had been a strange place and she had never seen where it was that I was. So that made her. I was so glad that happened. I was always thankful that my sister pushed herself and did that too. So now I did have the benefit of knowing one friend in Ohio that I got to know very well, and they were moving here also. She is a very close friend to this day, although now she's moved to Wisconsin. So, but when we moved here, I did feel like I knew 1 or 2 people that had the same terrible move that I had, moving somewhere they didn't want to go at that point in their lives, but they did. Moved into the house. The first day we were here, the lady across the street came over and said, we're having a going away party for the people that have just moved out of your house. And if you would like to come, we'd like to have you come. And she said, you'll get to meet all the neighbors on the street, because that would be who would be at the party. And so Don and I walked over that evening, so we got to meet the neighbors on the street. And I said to, which is what I always say, one of the women that I'm talking to, I said, is there anybody on the street that plays bridge? And she said she did a little bit, and but she wasn't very good. And she said, what you need to do is, she said, there's a newcomers group in Burnsville. You need to join that group because they have any number of bridge groups. So she said they meet the first Monday of every month. Well, this was early November, but the meeting was over. So I said, well, I'll try to remember that, and we'll have to. So that woman, bless her heart, she doesn't live here anymore. She called me on a Sunday evening, and she said, Faye, tomorrow's Monday morning, that's when the group meets. Would you like to go? And I said, yes, I want to go. And she said, well, I'm going to go and I'll take you. I'm introduced to the group as a newcomer in Minnesota, and they do a little biography of who this person is, where she moved from, and how many children she has, and what she likes to do. And so they said that she likes to play bridge, and she wants to, her needlework is very important to her. And so as the meeting broke up, different people came up to me and said, oh, Faye, you have to be in our needlework group. And the same thing with the bridge, you know. I met people right away that have become very important in my life, actually, to this day. And I've been here 35 years now, and still friends with some of these people who have stayed away, unlike my friend who moved to Wisconsin. So anyhow, it was just the thing you need to break the ice. And the woman across the street, she soon moved away, so she was not a friend, or not one of my friends that I've kept. But I learned to meet what seems like hundreds of other people, and it was the best thing that, in some ways, that happened. It was good for Philip, I think. Well, maybe I should let him make that decision. But it was certainly good for me. And it was good for Don. He could work out his last days in a very good job, and a job that he had sort of aspired to all his life. And it worked, but then it broke just before he retired, or just about the time he retired. They knew that things were just not going to work out. The big box stores, as they called them, the big stores came in, and the co-ops just couldn't compete unless you were an odd group of some sort. There are still some little co-ops around, and they keep trying. But what they were trying to start as a regular co-op grocery store chain failed. Don retired. Well, Don retired, and he decided to stay in Minnesota. By that time, we had decided that we liked it here, and we were just simply going to stay here. And actually, Jerry lived here at the time, and of course, Philip was still here. And so half my family was here, and we just decided we're going to stay here. And Don liked the place. Don liked Minnesota. And so he was retired, and it wasn't too long after he was retired that he got a call from an agency in Washington, D.C. It was called VOCA, Volunteers for Overseas Cooperative Assistance. I even got it all. Some organization in Washington, and they called and they said, would he go to the Philippines and help a small co-op credit union that was trying to start? Would he go there and help them? And they asked him to go for 2 months, 8 weeks, for which all his expenses would be paid. But it was a volunteer job. He didn't get paid to do it, but his expenses were paid. And of course, he was excited about it. This would be something he would like to do. And they would send me along also. I mean, I could go if I wanted to. So I decided I didn't want to. I could not see going to a small island somewhere in the Philippines. And it wasn't on the mainland. It was just a small island in the middle of nowhere. And I didn't want to go. And I didn't want to sit in a hotel. I just didn't want to do it. I never did like to move. And so he went. And he was happy about it. It was a good experience for him. He came back and he was happy. When he came back, he told me that that they wanted him to come back in 6 months to just kind of go over and see whether they were doing what he was suggesting, whether they were doing it the way he wanted it to do it. And so he said that they could not pay him to do that, but they would pay his way, he told me. And that was a lie. But I didn't know it. And so he went. He went just for a week, 10 days, something like that. And then he came back, and he was happy when he came back. And then, of course, it wasn't long till he started saying he was going to go again in 6 months. They wanted to come in another 6 months. Well, I should have been smart enough, but I wasn't. I mean, I believed him. And so he went over a period of 2 years. Every 6 months, twice a year, he would go. Okay. We were happy. I mean, I didn't know there was any problem. And the summer, he died in 1993, but it was the summer of 92. It was the last summer he lived. And he seemed warmer that summer than usual. I knew he wasn't feeling as good many times. But we got along. And there were different things. The whole summer, that last summer, we did a lot of traveling. Just east and back a couple times. And the first thing that hit me was I had gotten an invitation to go to my 50th high school reunion. Then in the town of Windber, they were going to have this high school reunion. Well, they were having them every so many years. I didn't know about them. But I had gotten this invitation. And I said, I'd kind of like to go. And there was one girl who lived in D.C. that was a friend of mine that usually went to things. She went with me to the 40th reunion, and this was the 50th one. And I said, I called her. Well, she couldn't go that summer. She had something else she was doing. So I was sort of disappointed. And I told Don about it. I said, I really kind of wanted to go. And I knew he didn't like things like that. And so a couple days later, he came to me and he said, why don't I go to the reunion with you? I said, would you like to? I said, I'd love to have you go with me. Well, he had really never been to Windber. He didn't know what the town was. He'd heard about it. And I guess he decided, well, it would be fun to go there, and you could show me where you used to live. And so we went east. And we got east. We were at John's. And we were going to go up later the next week or something to this reunion. But then I got a call from some good friends in Ohio. The annual church conference that year was going to be in Richmond, Virginia. Now, Don and I hadn't talked about going to this. Don never wanted to go to these conferences very often. I liked to go, but he was less likely to want to go. And the Stroups, the friends in Ohio, called. They were going to go to conference, and they said, why don't you come and go to conference with us? We were in the East already. And I said, yeah, I'd love to, but I'd have to see what Don would say. I asked Don about it. Yeah, let's go, he said. Well, we were going to go, and we were going to be with these friends, and we were going to meet a lot of other people that we knew at the church conference, because we knew people from Elgin, from Maryland, from different places. We'd meet some of these people. So we went to conference, and then we left conference, and we went directly from conference to the high school reunion. We doubled back up across Virginia, got back into Pennsylvania, had motel reservations, and went there. And we bummed around Windsor for a couple days, went to the reunion. And I felt bad different times at the reunion, because I would meet people, and you would have to talk so fast. And I would sometimes think about Don, and I'd think, what's happened to Don? And I would look around, and he was standing over there just having a big conversation with somebody. When we walked out of the hall that night, and we're going back to our car, he said to me, I'm so sorry I didn't go to my own high school reunion. It had been the year before. He had gotten an invitation. I said, why don't we go? No, he wouldn't go to something like that. He said, I'm sorry I didn't go to my own high school reunion. I said, well, it's too bad, that you've missed it. And then I would say to him, I said, what? I said, I felt bad that I was so busy talking that I couldn't pay attention to him. I couldn't even introduce him to some of the people because it happened so fast. And he said, well, he didn't mind. He said, I didn't mind. He said, I just found somebody to talk to. He said, I knew you were busy and talking. And he said, I just found somebody to talk to myself, that probably somebody who was without a friend or without a wife, too, or something, And so he probably did a good service for somebody, too. So that was good, and we had a good trip, and we came back. Well, we had a reunion in Pennsylvania with all the family on that trip. We had a number of trips like that summer. Remember, we went to, we spent a day or two in Shippensburg, which was a place that he didn't know either. He had never had any reason to go there. Remember spending an afternoon in the cemetery where my grandparents were buried, and we just looked and we took some pictures, and it was a good summer. It was a really good summer. And the fall was good. And then Christmas came. Well, in the fall, first of all, his youngest brother called and said he was coming to see him. Coming to see Don. Well, he was coming to see me too, I thought, but I guess he really wasn't. And he came, and they were very private, the two of them. Off talking by themselves, and they didn't include me in their conversation. I should have been suspicious. Then they took off, and they went up to Duluth for 2 or 3 days, and they had a good time. And I guess I was happy that he was having a good time. And I was doing my thing. I mean, I had my bridge games, and I wasn't suffering. As I said, I should have been suspicious. There was something going on there that I didn't know. So then comes November, and he tells me he's going to the Philippines for a week. And I didn't want him to go. His heart was bad, and I was so afraid that he was going to have a heart attack. In Japan, somewhere where he's laying over in it. He had to go to Japan and then go to the Philippines. And I thought, it was a long flight. I thought, you have no business doing this even to help these people, which is what he was still telling me. And I said, he said, well, he said, I can help these people. That's what he told me. And I said, if you want to help people, there's plenty of people in Dakota County. I can't remember the name of the county. There's plenty of people in Dakota County that need help, for heaven's sake. I remember having that argument with him one day. No, but he was going, and I couldn't tell him he couldn't go. So he went. He came back on the 8th of December, and I remember these days. Came back on the 8th of December, and on the 10th of December, he had an appointment with his doctor. He went to see the doctor, and he never wanted me to go with him when he went. But he came home and he told me that the doctor felt he was not doing too well, and he'd had this trip to the Philippines. But the doctor, and he said to the doctor, he said, well, how long do you think I really have? He had what they call a congestive heart, and it was bad, and there wasn't anything he could do. He asked the doctor, how long do you think it's going to last? And the doctor said, well, he said, probably a week, and probably a month. He said you might even have a year, but he wouldn't give him anything beyond that. He told me that, and I felt bad about it, but it was the 10th of December. So then we said, we had already planned that we were going to go back to Maryland for Christmas. We had a time there where one Christmas we'd be here, and the next Christmas everybody would go back there. Jim and Karen would come here, but if we were going to Maryland, we would all go to Maryland. And between John's house and Jeff's house, there was a place for all of us to stay. And so we said, we're going to do that. So on the 18th of December, Don and I left to drive to Maryland. We drove, take 2 days. We'd take 2 days, we got in there. And Jerry and Philip flew later. They came closer to Christmas. And Jim and Karen showed up about the time that we did. Had this whole family together, and we had such a good Christmas. I never can remember that we just had such a good time. And everybody was in good spirits. And we had one day we went to Pennsylvania, and all of the family got together. All of my family, nieces and nephews, we were all at my sister's for a big meal, big afternoon. I heard Don tell a number of people. People would ask him, how are you doing? And he said, I've been feeling good. I've been feeling better lately, Well, that's what you say, I guess. Anyhow, then we went to, John has a place in Harper's Ferry, a mountain place, home. So we all decided we were going to go there for New Year's Eve. And, Jerry and Philip had come back, so it was just Jeff and Cal, and John and Michael, Jim and Karen, and Catherine. We were all there for the evening, and found a place to stay. Michael was there, and he had fixed this huge dinner for us. Michael had made a little Cornish hen for each of us, stuffed them and fixed them, and Michael was a gourmet food person. So it was a very special evening. And we all stayed up for New Year's Eve except Don. Don said he was tired and he was going to go to bed about 10:30, which we could understand. And then the next day, we went back to Maryland. Now it's the 2nd of January, we went back to Maryland. We must have stayed there over the 1st. Then on the 3rd of January, Don and I had an invitation to have dinner with a couple that we knew there. We went did that. And then on the 4th of January, no, Faye, you're wrong. On the 3rd of January, it was Jeff and Cal that were going to have dinner. They want us to come back to their house for dinner. And Jim and Karen were still there. They had not gone back to California yet. So we were all, well, not all of us, but Jeff and Jerry wasn't there, and Philip. The rest of us were there. We have a lovely dinner that Jeff and Cal had fixed. When dinner was over, and I'll never forget this, they went out their back door. And I thought, well, where are they going? It's cold out there. And then they came back in. They walked back in the house, and they had this big plate with cake on it and a whole bunch of candles on the top, lit. They had gone out to light the candles. And they come in carrying this cake because this was the 3rd of January. On the 4th of January, we were leaving to drive back here. The 5th of January was Karen's birthday, and the 6th of January was my birthday. And they had remembered this, and so they're having a birthday party. We had cake and ice cream, and it was fine, and we left that evening from Jeff's and went back to John. And then at 6 o'clock on the morning of the 4th, Don and I got in the car to drive back to Minnesota. We drove all day. We talked and talked all day. We talked about everything. About this gift and this conversation with so-and-so, and we talked until we were tired of talking, I think. And then we stopped at somewhere in Indiana and rented a motel room and to spend the night. We slept. Both went to bed early and slept, and then he woke up early. And I caught him. He was coming out of the bathroom, and I said, "What? Oh, you can't sleep?" He said, "No." He said, "I'm ready to go." It was about 4:30 in the morning. He said, "No." He said, "I'm ready to go." He said, "How long do you think it'll take you to get ready?" And I said, "Oh, I can be ready in 15 minutes. So he went and checked out of the motel, put the bags in the car, and by 5 o'clock we were on the road. Oh, 4:30 maybe we were on the road. Came around Chicago and up through Wisconsin. And we got to Eau Claire and stopped for lunch. After we left Eau Claire, we got in the car and we were coming back toward Hudson, Wisconsin. And there was a long period in the car that we were very quiet. I think we were tired of talking. We'd probably said everything we had to say. And then he looked at me. He was driving, and he said, "You know," he said, "there are 3 things that I wish I could do over." He said, "There are 3 things I did to you that I really wish I could do over." Now, I said, "What are you talking about?" I didn't know what he was talking about. And so he enumerated what he was talking about, and he was right. They were 3 things that he had really done wrong by me. And he knew it, and I knew it, and we argued about it over the years. And we knew this. And I should say this, but when I got pregnant with Philip, I was not supposed to be able to get pregnant. I did not want to have another baby. I had 4. I didn't need 5. And besides, I had had a 5th baby that died, and I didn't want to do that again. And but there wasn't anything we could do. This was 1974. The Wade, what is the other word? The Supreme Court decision, Roe versus Wade, that wasn't until 67. There wasn't a thing we could do about it. I was going to have another baby. And, of course, he felt bad about it, and he kept saying, "Well, we'll just get through it." That's all we kept telling her. So we'll get through it, and as soon as it's over, you will have a tubal ligation. We'll never do this again. And I said, yes, of course. Then when Philip was along about 7 months, suddenly we knew we had to go to the hospital. I was hemorrhaging. And we were going to have this baby. The doctor said there wasn't anything he could do, and it was going to have to be a C-section. So my first word to that doctor was, all right, when the baby is taken care of, then you tie the tubes. I'll never forget that doctor's face. He turned pale, and he said, I can't do that. I said, why can't you do that? And he said, because he said, we haven't applied to do it. We're in the state of Maryland, which is a good Catholic state. He said, in order for you to do that, he said, you have to sign all kinds of papers, and then you have to wait 6 weeks. There's a 6-week waiting period. He said, if we had signed the papers, if we had done that, he said, I probably could have gotten a waive on the time period. But he said, nothing has been approved. He said, we can't do that. And he would have wanted to do it, but so he wasn't upset that he couldn't do it. He wanted to. And so he said, we just have to do what we have to do, and 6 weeks after you have this baby, we'll take care of it, you know. So then 6 weeks after I have the baby, well, then he calls Dawn. We had just walked out of the house and left the kids in the yard. And he had to get back and make arrangements for the kids. And the doctor called him. And the first thing he said to the doctor, he says, when you're in there, tie the tubes, you know. And we knew what we needed to do. And so the doctor told him the same story. So then we wait till after this, I've recovered from the surgery and so on. I go back to see the doctor. And the last thing Don said to me that morning is, he said, now be sure you get a date. We've got to get this thing started, scheduled. Okay, I said. So I go see the doctor, and the doctor said, you know, he said, your husband wants this as bad as you do. For heaven's sakes, why doesn't he have a vasectomy? He said, in your case, we have to open the abdomen again, because in those days they did it differently than they do it today. He said, I don't want to do that surgery again. He said, your husband can have a vasectomy. So I thought, well, yeah, why not? That's a much simpler procedure. So I went home that night, and when he came, he said, well, have you scheduled the date? And so I could tell him, well, we decided that you should have a vasectomy. Oh, well, that's when he got pale in the face. And he never did it. He never did it. He went to the doctor. He found every excuse he could. And there was even, our health coverage wouldn't pay for his vasectomy, where it would pay for mine. But anyhow. But, you know, even then, it was $100. I said, Don, we can afford. Well, anyhow, that was the first thing that he was apologizing for. But anyhow, at the time, I was really dumbfounded. I thought, you know, why are you talking about this? You know, we've talked about this, but okay, I appreciate the fact that you're sorry, you know. And the next thing we saw a sign that said Hudson, Wisconsin, and we changed the subject. Knowing we only have 30 more miles home or something like that, and we started thinking about getting home. And that was the end of that conversation. So, get home, and we were, the car was full of things, Jerry and Philip had left all their presents there, things like that. Um, we had we just filled up the trunk in the back seat of the car with things that they didn't want to bring back in the plane. And the chair you're sitting on, John gave that day. And in one of those chairs, one of the dining room chairs, he had some extra ones, and they were exactly like the chairs I had. He said, Mother, take these chairs home with you. He took them apart and put them on the back seat of the car. So we have all this stuff to carry in the house. We come in, and we had, the mail was here. There was almost 3 weeks of mail. A lot of Christmas cards. We sat at the table and we went through the mail and read the Christmas cards that we had not gotten until a week after. And it was just a good afternoon. About sometime during the afternoon, the phone rang and one of my friends called and said, Faye, tomorrow's your birthday. This would be the 5th. They said, tomorrow is your birthday. We're going to take you out to lunch. Okay, I said, I can do that. Then later on in the afternoon, I got another call from a friend who said, Faye, this is your bridge night. Such and such a group played bridge on the first Tuesday of the month. And I had forgotten about it. And she said, do you think you can come? And I said, we're home fairly early and everything's kind of taken care of here. Yeah, I said, I think I'll come and play bridge. Don said he was tired. I asked him what he thought. He said, well, I'm tired. He said, I'm going to go to bed early. And he said, why don't you go? So I fixed some supper. We sat here on the couch and ate TV dinners. That's what I fixed for dinner. And at 7 o'clock, I got up and kissed him goodbye, brushed my teeth, and went out the door. 7 o'clock, my friend came and got me. One of the girls said, I'll pick you up. And she didn't. I was still driving, but she could pick me up that night. So we played bridge. 10:30, I said, I'm tired, girls. I'm going to go home. Why don't we stop at this point? And they said, oh, yeah, sure. Why don't you? So we went down in the foyer of this house, put on our boots and our coats. And then all of a sudden, one of the girls in the dining room area remembered the birthday. Oh, so they had to sing happy birthday, and they weren't the girls involved the next day. And then they had to come and they had to talk, and we were another half hour getting out of the house. And but we left and got in the car and came home. Drove up on the driveway, and the first thing I noticed was the light in the room upstairs where Don's desk was, the light was still on. And he had said he was going to read for a while till he got sleepy. So I thought, well, maybe he's still awake, And my friend was telling me a story. So I just sat there while she finished the story. And then I got my purse and got out of the car and said goodbye and came in the house. And as I do, I guess, I came in the house, hung up my coat, and I went in the kitchen. Well, there were dishes in the sink. So I'm rinsing off dishes. I'm doing things that afterwards I wondered why, but anyhow I did. And eventually I went upstairs. And when I went by the door, I noticed he was on the floor. I said, what are you doing? That was my response. What are you doing? And then I realized he didn't move. So I stopped and went back in the room and realized what had happened. And so, of course, I was back down the stairs, called 911. And they came and took him to the hospital, but of course it was I knew it had obviously been too long. I knew that. And but they brought him down and put him in the ambulance, and we went to the hospital. I didn't go with him. When they were trying to start his heart upstairs, the policeman brought me downstairs. He said, "You come down here." He said, "There's nothing you can do here, and nothing you can do up there." He said, "Just sit down here and relax." And then he took out his notebook, and he wanted names and ages and so on and so on. And then he said, "Do you have a friend you could call?" He said, "You really should have somebody with you." I jumped up and I called one of the girls that had been playing bridge with me. And I knew she had just gotten home. Figured she might even still be dressed. And they were sort of the closest couple that we had here at the time. And I just dialed her number. I knew the number. And I said what happened. She said, "We'll be right here," and hung up the phone. There was not even any conversation between us. Really. So they were here, and they took me to the hospital. They came before they put him in the ambulance. So they took me to the hospital. Well, the policeman also called Philip that night. Philip was down at Shooter's at the pool hall, and he worked there. And I knew that's where he was. But he came right home, too. 5 minutes he was up here. So we went to the emergency room. Of course, they pronounced him dead, and that was. So we came back, and on the way back, Philip brought me in his car because Carol said she was going home. But what she was doing was she was going home to get clothes because she was going to come and stay the night with me. And so Philip brings me home, and about 10 minutes later, Carol came too. But I came in and went upstairs to take my clothes off and get comfortable, I guess. But I noticed Don's light was still on at the desk. So I go in his room to turn the light off, and here's this letter laying on the desk. And I thought, well, who is he writing to? And I honestly thought, for one brief second, I thought maybe he had done something and that this was a farewell note to me. I honestly thought that because he and his brother John often talk about euthanasia. And I thought, has he done something? Well, but I turned the page over, and then I saw the name. Well, all of a sudden it hit me like a lead balloon that there has been a friend somewhere, Well, the name on the address, he had already addressed the envelope. That was to a woman in the Philippines. So it all is out of the bag. And I had the second shock for the evening. So, what do you do?
How was that, dude?
You just recover.
Yeah.
You just bite the bullet and do what you have to do. When my friend came, she came upstairs, and I showed it to her. I did show it to her. I did not ever tell Philip for a while. Well, for a long time I didn't tell Philip. And in fact, I didn't want the boys to know. I just didn't think they needed to know that. And so that was a secret. But eventually I ended up telling a couple of friends. And finally, one of my friends said, "Faye," she said, "I really think you need to tell the boys." She said, "They're big boys. It's not going to kill them." And she said, "Someday they're going to hear it. Somehow it's going to get out," she said. So she said, "Tell them." So one by one I told them. And they didn't seem particularly I don't think they knew anything, any of them. Somehow I knew there's more. There's more. And one day I was upstairs, and my husband had a big file-like thing, and it had a fake safe on it. But it had a thing that if you didn't know the number, you couldn't turn it and open it. And I didn't know the number. But I looked at this thing, and I thought, there's something in there. There's something in there. And I called my sister-in-law. My sister-in-law and I are on good terms by that time. This is Margaret in Washington. I called her on the phone. I said, Margaret, I had already told her this, so she knew. I said, what do you think I should do with this thing? What am I going to do? I said, I think I could pry it open if I got something. She said, well, think about it for a while, she said. There's no reason you have to do anything. But Jerry had been here, and he was doing my income tax, and he was looking for something. He was looking for a certain paper. Well, maybe it's in there, you know, and this bothered me. And I thought, Jerry's going to come back, and he's going to get in there. And I want to do it before he does it. And because Jerry didn't know about this yet. So I went down in the basement, down in the shop, and I got a big crowbar. I went back upstairs, and with the crowbar, I can pry this thing open. The door came open, and there is a box, a big box, all taped over with tape. And he must have done it just before we went to Maryland for Christmas. And on the box is scribbled, well, is an address. In case of my death, it said, send this immediately. No, it said it was the property of John David Lefever. That was his brother that he had this fun with in the fall. And I was to send this box to him immediately in case of his death. Well, I got back on the phone with my sister-in-law, and I said, what do you think about this? And she said, well, he's hiding something in there. She said, open it when you're ready, you know. So I certainly wouldn't send it to John David. So I didn't, and it wasn't long. Well, I think I opened it right away. I said to my sister-in-law, I said, you stay on the phone and talk to me, and I am going to open this box. That's what I did. And we opened the box, and I'm telling her what I'm seeing as I open the box. And the box is full of letters. Every letter he ever got from her, from this woman. He had saved them. But after what the doctor told him about how close he was to an end, maybe, I think he thought, maybe I should hide these. Maybe I should get rid of these things, or I should do something with them, you know. So he put them in the box and taped them shut. I mean, the tape was all over the box, over the cardboard box. Anyhow. So there were all these letters. Well, now what am I going to do with all these letters? At that point, I still had the letter that was on the desk also. And I had the address, too. But she had she spoke English poorly, this woman. And her letters were hard to read. I guess he had worked harder at it than I was willing to work. And but I could, and it was over the 2-year period that these letters came. But there was that summer, the last summer he lived, that I was telling you, where I started with he and I doing things together, going to the class reunion and all these happy times we were having. I sort of went through the letters and found some from that summer. Kind of wanted to know what was going on that summer. And indefinitely, it was worth my time. She was really working on him to leave me and marry her. She wanted, what a person like this wanted was to come to the States. She wanted to come here, get a better job, and she was determined that she was going to. And I found one letter in the beginning where she said that when he went over the very first time, she was sent from the office to meet him at the airport and make arrangements for him to stay in a certain hotel. She was the secretary. She was supposed to do these things for the guys. And she said in one of her letters that it was love at first sight. She fell in love with him when she saw him. She was much younger than he was. But she fell in love with what she wanted, I guess. So. But anyhow, that last summer, when she was really apparently working him over in these letters, I, of course, couldn't see what I didn't see his letter, so I don't know what he's saying to her. But she said a number of times in the letter, she said, I understand that your family is really important to you, and I understand that, And she said, at that point she was saying, I'll have to live with it, and so on. I don't know. But I think that he would not have done what she wanted him to do. I really think he had, well, I don't know. But anyhow, he had second thoughts at that point, and he obviously wasn't going to do it. So he kept telling her that his boys were too important to him, and he was not going to do that to them. And he was not going to hurt their mother, I don't think either. That was in there too. And so that was the story. And that was hard. That was very hard. It has to be. Just the shock of him dying at that point, I don't know. I had to deal with it. But I kind of just put that behind me, even though I didn't know the other things about the letters and so I didn't know that. I still thought, well, it didn't happen. She didn't get away with it, So, and of course, the big problem that night was deciding. We had just come back from all those visits in Maryland. We're not going to have a memorial service here. I don't have a church here. And the boys all right away said, well, Mother, we have to go back to Maryland or Pennsylvania for the memorial service. And they all said, we don't want to do it right now. We've just been there. We've spent money, and Jim and Karen from California had spent all their vacation time. They said they didn't want to think about going back to Maryland again for a while. And so we decided right away that we're going to wait a couple months, and then we'll go back to Maryland and have them. And we decided right away that we'll go back to Maryland to have the memorial service rather than Pennsylvania. That it's close enough that the family can come down there. And we had a lot of friends there still. So we waited till late in March. Well, we waited till March. And about the 1st of March, I had invitations printed and sent them to all the friends and all the family. And the church that we had been part of at University Park, I had contacted the minister there, didn't know her, had never met her, and told her who we were, and she knew about us. And she said, well, surely we could use the church on a Saturday afternoon and have a memorial service. And she would work with me. She said, I'll do anything you need for me to do. And so I went back a week early, and I went down to the church and met the minister, and we talked about what we wanted as part of the service and so on. And I had planned it. The boys all said to me, Mother, you plan it. You do what you want to do. And so I had asked different ones to speak. I wanted his older brother to say something. I didn't want Ern, and I was angry at the younger brother because I thought he knew about all this affair too. No, anyhow, I asked his older brother to speak for the brothers. And then I wanted Jim to speak for my sons. You know, in other words, I'm asking one person in each group. I wanted one person from our church group to speak and do sort of eulogy-like things, you see. And there was one man that he worked with. Now, the man was in California, but he was very much a person that Don worked with most of his life. He was with co-ops in California, but they worked together. I had contacted him, and I knew he wouldn't come to the service, but I said, if you have anything you'd like to say, you know, maybe you can write it and we can have it read. And oh yes, he wanted to say something. He wanted to talk. So we got that from him. So I planned this, and then, and this is important too, I decided I want some sort of scripture read. I wasn't sure what. I didn't want traditional funeral scriptures read. I'd heard too many of those with all the funerals I had been to in my lifetime. So I gave that a lot of thought. And finally I came up with, I think it's the 6th chapter of, oh boy, I'm awful. I won't say it right now. It's a book in the Old Testament, the 6th chapter of Micah. And it ends with, it's a whole chapter that I was going to have read. But it ends with the verse that, you know, what is required of you but to love your God and do something about doing justice. And I thought, you know, that's what speaks to what Don was. So that's what the scripture was I wanted read. So we're going to, the memorial service is planned, and everybody, Jerry flew in, Jim and Karen flew in, the family was all there, and they were all planning to come from Pennsylvania. And we had nephews in Indiana. They had driven in the day before. On Friday, they drove in so that they would be halfway there. And about 4 o'clock Friday afternoon, the phone rang, and it was the minister from the church. And she said, Faye, she said, do you have an alternative plan? I said, an alternative plan? Why would I want to have an alternative plan? She said, well, haven't you heard about the snowstorm? I said, what? Well, I was busy. I hadn't the TV. I don't turn the TV on in John's house. And we didn't have a radio on. And they're busy. Nobody paid any attention to what was going on. And here they're predicting this huge snowstorm to come up the East Coast. And Washington, D.C. was to get 20 inches of snow that night. And she said, what are you going to do if it actually snows like that? Well, I don't have a plan. I said, I don't know what we'll do. Well, then she said that maybe we could use the church on Sunday afternoon. Maybe the roads would get cleared. Maybe it wouldn't be that bad. And so I said, okay, well, we'll just wait and see. So then pretty soon I started getting calls from Pennsylvania. Faye, what are you going to do if it snows? We're not going to be able to get there. Well, so there was nothing to do but go to bed Friday night, and there's not a snowflake on the ground. And went to bed, tried to go to sleep. I got up at 12 o'clock, and there's no snow on the ground. I got up at 2 o'clock, and I looked out the window. And yes, the ground is getting white, and it's snowing hard. And they're great big flakes that just come down. And we got up at 6 o'clock, and Jim got up with me. I remember he came, and he said, oh, Mother, what's going to happen? And by then, you know, there's 15 inches on the ground. And by 9 o'clock, there's 20 inches on the ground. And I started getting calls from Pennsylvania, Faye, we can't come. And I said, well, we're going to have to cancel it. Nobody here can go either. So what can you do? Well, we'll see what happens tomorrow. And maybe you can come tomorrow. And but then by the next day, it was worse up in Pennsylvania. And so Sunday morning, I'm getting the call saying, Faye, we can't come today either. Well, then the kids had their plane tickets. They were all leaving to come back on Sunday evening, or to go back to California. They were leaving on Sunday evening. So I thought, we can't even wait till Monday. You know, this is just, we just have to cancel it. It was canceled. Anyhow. But there was one saving grace for me. There was a minister that we had early on at University Park. He was a very young man when he came to University Park, and he liked Don. Don was older, and he kind of came to Don for advice sometimes, and he liked to talk to Don a lot. So he had left Maryland, and he was called back to Elgin. He had a good job at the church office in Elgin. And he had a call when Don died. As soon as he died, all our friends called different people. And this man got a call. And he called me about 2 days after Don died, and he said, he asked what I was going to do about a memorial service, and I told him what we were thinking. And he said, well, let me know when you're going to have it, because he said, if at all possible, he said, I will go. He said, I want to be there. He said he wanted to say something, too. He was one on the program, too, that I had. So, fine. So he came. He flew in on Friday when all the planes were still flying, and stayed with friends. And then he called me on Saturday morning. He said, Faye, he said, this is terrible, you know. Well, he had told me that I have to be back in Chicago on Sunday. He was leaving Sunday morning because he had a commitment in Chicago on Sunday afternoon. He said, I can be there on Saturday, but I can't be there. Oh, I'm missing something. The group that we were part of in Maryland, the group that this man helped us to start, it was sort of our own little house church. They wanted to have a dinner. They wanted to have it Saturday evening, and I said, no. My family will still be around from Pennsylvania. I said, I can't go away from them to be at your dinner. And so then they said, well, what if we have it on Sunday afternoon? I said, all right, I'll still be there. And the boys, they wanted to have it with the boys. The guys had grown up with these people. They had children the same age, and they wanted to see the boys, my boys, and they said, we'll have this potluck on Sunday afternoon before your kids leave again. And I said, fine. So Sunday morning, there was still doubt that we were even going to get together to do that some of them might not be able to get there. But they were still hoping they could have it. Sunday morning, after the people in Pennsylvania told me they couldn't come Sunday afternoon, we canceled everything. And then we decided to have the potluck dinner. And then I got a call from this minister. He said, Faye, he said, I thought I couldn't be at the potluck this afternoon, but he said there are no planes taking off from BWI. The runways aren't clear. He said, I'm going to still be there. He said, I have to cancel what I was going to do in Chicago. But he said, I'm going to be there with all the group. I said, fine. So we met in one of the houses. One of the families had a big house. And we all got together. And after we were sort of all together, the minister said to me, Faye, why don't we have a memorial service right here? I said, fine. I would love to do that. And of course, then he could just be in charge. And he just kind of did it. And we didn't have the programs that we had printed. They were at the church. And anyhow, the place where we were, there was a great big piano in the living room. And one of the girls played very well. And we sang songs. It was a happy time. But then the music was over and we got into the eulogies. And there wasn't a dry eye in the place. I mean, it was the most touching thing I've ever done. And that minister called me later on, week afterwards. And he was concerned whether I had had enough closure by skipping the memorial service, by not having one. He was worried that maybe I should still be doing something. And I said, no, after that memorial service we had with the friends and with that particular minister that was important to Dawn, I said, no, I feel very good about the whole thing now. And but my family, and they tell me this, and they still tell me this, that they felt cheated. And they were. And they were. So that's something I had no control over. So the whole his dying was such a shock, and then it just seemed like nothing was right for a time. But the thing that was such a surprise then was the idea that somebody was going to start a church here. And that happened right after. Well, actually, of course, the district had already, they were already working on this. I'm just sorry that Don didn't know about it. And that we didn't know about it sooner, too. Not that that would have changed anything, I suppose. But anyhow, when that winter then, the rest of that winter, of course, I went through a lot of thinking about, should I move back east? Should I still stay here? What am I going to do? And, of course, as everybody always says, don't do anything in a hurry. You know, take your time and think it over. So I kept saying, no, I'm not going to do anything rash here. I'm going to wait and see how it all works out. Well, then when it worked out that I heard that Jay was here and that they were going to try to start a church, well, it gave me something to be involved with, and gave me more time to think too about, well, I believe maybe you should just stay here. And I really was so well fixed with friends here that Had I gone back to Maryland, I would have been starting all over. Had I gone to Pennsylvania, my family was there, but I had never lived there. Where my family lives in Lancaster County, I had never lived there. Went to college there, but I grew up in the western part of the state. I never lived in Lancaster County. And to me, had I moved there, we're all the same age, we're all getting old. We need people that can help us. I want to be near one of my children, at least, because there's going to be a time when I'm going to need somebody. And they're close to their children where they are. I mean, that's their problem, not mine. So I'm glad it worked out the way it did. And I was glad that, that Jerry was able to come back to the Twin Cities. Of course, in Wisconsin, he wasn't that far away, but when it worked out that he came back here, why that? And he, right away, he just sort of took over, saying, helping with any financial question.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he just is the one to talk to. I'm not sure, but what he isn't better than any of the other four would have been. Okay. And so that was, in the beginning, I remember that first week he went to the bank with me and we talked to somebody. Well, it was just setting up a few things. And for a few years, I did do my own banking and did my own thing. But I guess he always did my income tax. He would always do that. He would always volunteer to do that. And then eventually when I started talking about redoing the will, we had a will, Don and I had a will, but we needed to redo that. And so a couple years back we did that, and then I gave him power of attorney and all that. I've just been very thankful for very thankful for the relationship I've had with all 5 of my children. I think that frequently in families of that size, there's often one that doesn't get along, or there's a problem with, somehow with something, and I just can't say that about any of them. I love all of them, and I'm just so happy when they get together, and I can just enjoy them being together and being with me. It's been a good life. So, and I'm happy. I will always be unhappy about the girl I lost, but that's life too. That's past. I always was going to have a baby girl. 5 times I was going to have a baby girl. But it doesn't work. But the 6th time it was. And she didn't live. So there's one thing I think I want to tell. When I think when women marry, I know my mother, we used to talk about this. We kind of looked forward to having a wedding, a 50th wedding anniversary, say. Just having some anniversaries to think about, too. And so my mother, maybe I think about that because she often talked about it. She always sort of rued the fact that her husband died before they got to 50 years. And so when Don died, I had the same situation. We had only been married 47 years, which was just about the same length of time my mother had been married, too. And So in the back of my mind, not that I think I looked forward to it like she did, still it would cross my mind. So come along, May the 19th, 1996 was 50 years. And a strange thing happened. We were married on a Sunday afternoon, and May the 19th in 1996 was a Sunday also. Now that doesn't always happen. I got up on May the 19th, and it had been a rainy week, and the sun came out, and it was a beautiful day. And at some point, while I was getting dressed to go to church, I thought, this is May the 19th. This would have been my 50th wedding anniversary. Really hit me. Well, I was so happy I had church to go to. We were still meeting in the funeral home. Jerry wasn't here. Philip was probably working that day, because Philip worked every weekend down at Shooter's. And so, I was on my own. I was going to go to church. I got dressed and I went. And got there. I didn't say anything to anybody. And the service started. And I don't remember what Todd played or sang. He didn't sing as much then. He'd play something often. But I'm sure I was happy with it. And then Jay got up to preach his sermon. And he started to talk. And he was talking about justice. Now this is hitting me pretty hard, because he kept saying things that Don would say. And Jay, as he always did, or when he used to do it more than he does now, he would talk for quite a while. And then toward the end of the sermon, he would open his Bible and get to the scripture he was sort of relating what he said to. And he would read a chapter or so from the Bible. And so what does he choose to read but the 6th chapter of Micah? Now you tell me. And of course, I'm sitting there by myself. Nobody's sitting next to me. And the tears were coming down my cheek. I just couldn't control it. I mean, I'll never forget that, as long as I live. And so we sang the closing hymn, and church was over. People started moving around and talking to each other. Conversations started. And I'm still standing there. And there was a woman in front of me, a young woman. She wasn't married. I turned around and she said, "Faye, what is wrong?" I think she noticed the tears. She noticed my eyes, I think. And she came right back to me, put her arm around me, and I said, "It's okay. There's nothing wrong." I said, "It's all fine." And then I told her what it was. I told her what had happened. And she gave me a hug, and that was it. And I left. Came home. Spent the afternoon by myself. And I don't know, I think one time I started to tell Jay about it, but I'm not sure that I ever told him the whole story. So it doesn't matter. But it was just too impossible. I mean, how could that have happened?